Bom, boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde a todos. Estamos começando mais um evento do LERO, Laboratório de Estudos do Romance da USP. E é um enorme prazer receber aqui o professor David Cunningham, da Universidade de Westminster. E está presente aqui também ao meu lado o professor Jorge Manzi, da PUC de Santiago, do Chile. O Jorge fez o doutorado conosco no Departamento de Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada, uma tese premiada como a melhor tese do ano pela Abralic, e agora é professor lá no Chile, o que muito nos alegra, e ele está aqui não apenas para debater, mas também porque ele é um dos responsáveis pelo nosso contato com o professor David Cunningham. O professor David Cunningham escreve sobre teoria do romance já há muito tempo, com uma abordagem muito próxima das perspectivas da teoria crítica que nós desenvolvemos, em parte no Brasil e em especial na USP. Uma relação, uma abordagem que busca entender o romance do século XIX e do século XX a partir de analogias com o processo social e a partir de uma elaboração do conteúdo formal, da forma desses romances como expressão estética de questões sociais e políticas e filosóficas mais relevantes. Então, antes de passar a palavra ao professor David Cunningham, vou passar a palavra ao Jorge para que ele diga algumas palavras aos alunos dele que estão também nos assistindo lá no Chile.
Muy bien, es una alegría para mí poder presentar al profesor David Cunningham de la Universidad de Westminster. Empecé a leer su trabajo en 2016, mientras hacía mi doctorado en la Universidad de Sao Paulo, y al leer su trabajo sobre teoría de la novela y sobre modernismo, recuperando a Lukács y leyéndolo un poco desde Adorno, revisando posiciones de Lukács a partir de Adorno, pensé que había un vínculo profundo con la tradición crítica del Departamento de Teoría Literaria y Literatura Comparada y de varios departamentos y estudios de la literatura y el arte de la Universidad de São Paulo. Entonces, desde 2016 que tenía la aspiración de ponerlos en contacto. Y hoy día finalmente llegó ese día y tenemos a David Cunningham con nosotros para hablar sobre teoría de la novela y el problema de formlessness, que no tiene una traducción muy feliz en español ni en portugués, porque amorfismo no funciona, ¿no? Falta de forma, pérdida de forma, como una lógica esencialmente moderna y de la sociedad capitalista, que es lo que nos va a presentar David. Solo quería decir algunas palabras sobre su trayectoria, muy larga trayectoria como profesor de la Universidad de Westminster. Ha sido miembro del comité editorial de Radical Philosophy, que ha publicado muchísimos artículos de mayor interés, de teoría crítica, crítica a la contemporaneidad y crítica estética moderna y contemporánea. Sus intereses de investigación tienen que ver con modernismo, estética, teoría del urbanismo y teoría de la novela. Actualmente es el director de investigación de la Escuela de Humanidades y es director del Instituto Interdisciplinario de Cultura Moderna y Contemporánea en la Universidad de Westminster. Sus publicaciones son muchísimas, los invito también a seguirlo en academia.edu, donde tiene varios trabajos, donde destaco Capitalist Epics, un trabajo muy interesante sobre la teoría del romanticismo de Jena sobre la novela que se llama Género sin género, Genre Without Genre, que yo he traducido de manera informal y dispongo para mis estudiantes en Chile, pero creo que son trabajos que valdría mucho la pena conocer más, divulgar más, traducir al portugués, al español, en fin. Entonces, sin mayor presentación, me gustaría dejar con ustedes al profesor David Cunningham, que nos va a leer su conferencia sobre Formlessness and the Theory of the Novel. Por favor, David, dejamos contigo la palabra.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to receive you here. although online, but I hope this will be, there will be an opportunity to bring you to Brazil to hear you in person. So thank you very much. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'll see if I can share my slides again. Oh, there we go. Okay. So yes, thanks first of all so much for the invitation to do this, and sorry that I can't be with you in person, and sorry too that I have to speak in English to you today. But greetings from London in doing so, and I'm going to start by referencing the work of one of the great Brazilian critics, partly as an excuse for my English talk and from being so distant from you. Okay, so I will begin. So in a 1979 essay devoted in large part to the work of Antonio Candido and translated into English as Objective Form, Reflections on the Dialectic of Roguery, the great Brazilian critic Roberto Schwartz writes, get my PowerPoint, writes that the junction between novel and society happens through the form, the latter being understood as a mediating principle which organizes the elements of fiction and reality and is part of both. In sum, before it is intuited and made objective by the novelist, the form the critic studies has been produced by the social process, even if no one is aware of its existence. This, as Schwartz concludes, is, quote, an emphatic theory of literary realism and of social reality as something formed, a theory that he relates specifically to that of Lukács, whose, quote, aesthetic constructions depend precisely on the objectivity and historicity of social forms. As Lukács famously puts it himself in an oft-quoted line from his 1909 essay, The Evolution of Modern Drama, form is, from this perspective, the most truly social element in literature. Form is the most truly social element in literature. In the paper that follows, I want to say something about what Schwartz terms this emphatic theory of literary realism and of its relation to the objectivity and historicity of social forms. But I want to approach this from what is perhaps an unusual direction, that is, from the problem of formlessness. To anticipate my argument, if form is the most truly social element in literature, then formlessness, or more precisely the form of formlessness, I want to argue is itself a kind of social form. Specifically, formlessness appears above all as that of the social form of the accumulation of capital, I will argue, or of what Marx terms the actual abstraction of that self-moving substance in the shape of money. In this way, the novel mimics the contradictory character of sociality in capitalist societies more generally, which are themselves constituted through a continual dissolution and reconfiguring of social form. That is to say, formlessness, as a form that the critic studies, to use Schwartz's words again, is itself an objective social form, through which the junction between novel and society, as Schwartz describes it, takes place. So this would be my key claim in the paper, that formlessness is itself a kind of social form, and as a social form is related specifically to money or to the accumulation of capital. But I'll come back to that in more detail in a moment. First of all, then, that a problem of formlessness is in some sense central to the history of attempts to theorize the novel is fairly obvious. As Ian Watt, for example, writes in his seminal The Rise of the Novel, published in 1957, quote, "The novel is the logical literary vehicle of a culture which in the last few centuries has set an unprecedented value on originality, on the novel, on the new. This emphasis on the new accounts for some of the critical difficulties which the novel is widely agreed to present. One reason for this," Watt continues, "seems to be that since the novelist's primary task is to convey the impression of fidelity to human experience, attention to any pre-established formal conventions can only endanger his or her success. What is often felt then as the formlessness of the novel, as compared with, say, with tragedy or the ode, probably follows from this. The poverty of the novel's formal conventions would seem to be the price it must pay for its realism." In Lukács's own works, dating back to his very earliest writings, this feeling of formlessness is similarly related to the modernity of the novel. In his 1908 essay, The Moment and Form, for example, devoted to the Austrian poet and playwright Richard Beer Hoffmann, included in the collection Soul and Form, Lukács asserts that, quote, humanity and form are the central problems of all art, if, as he notes parenthetically, admittedly only today. So the first of the quotes here. There have been times, at least we believe there have been, Lukács writes, when the thing we call form today, the thing we look for so feverishly, the thing we try to snatch from the continual movement of life in the cold ecstasy of artistic creation, was simply the natural language of revelation. In those times, no one asked questions about the nature of form. No one separated form from matter or from life. No one knew that form is something different from either of these. Form was just the simplest way, the shortest path to understanding between two similar souls, the poets and the publics. But this today, he writes, has become a problem. From the perspective of modernity, when we do ask questions about the nature of form, the most profound meaning of form is then, Lukács declares, quote, to mold the directionless, precipitous, many-coloured stream of life. The necessity of form is that it, quote, sets limits around a substance which otherwise would dissolve into air like the all, and so is able to form something new out of formlessness, This is an evidently classical conception, of course. Indeed, one can recognize here a certain version of what in the history of philosophy is known as hylomorphism, in which while matter is construed as indeterminate and infinite, form is precisely that which gives determinacy and limits to matter. Matter on this account, as Hegel puts it, is, quote, determined as formless identity through its relation to form. Nonetheless, Lukács's particular historicization of this relation of form to formlessness raises a separate question of why, on this account, form has specifically become a problem today. To cite again from the essay, The Moment and Form, second long quote here, what must be sacrificed for the sake of form? Perhaps because the existing forms are not the product of our life today, or because our life today is so inartistic, so haphazard, so uncertain and weak, it is quite incapable of transforming for its own ends whatever aspect of the existing forms could change with time, which must be changed if we are to have a living art. And so today, Lukács continues, we have either abstract form, the result of thinking about art, of admiring great works of the past and exploring their mysteries, form which cannot encompass the specific qualities, the beauties and riches of the art of today, or else there is no form at all. And anything that produces an effect does so simply through the power of shared experience and becomes incomprehensible as soon as the experience is no longer shared. This may or may not be the reason for the conflict, Lukács concludes, but a conflict there most certainly is, and just as certainly there was no such conflict in the really great periods of the past. The tension or conflict marked in this passage between existing forms and what he calls our life today evidently articulates on the young Lukács's part a specifically modern dynamic of tradition's negation and of the emphasis on the new that Ian Watt describes, in which what constitutes form itself is continuously remade. As much to the point, one also recognizes in this the basis of those conclusions of Lukács's later and somewhat better known The Theory of the Novel, in which, unlike the ancient epic, for which form is not a problem or a question, since it scarcely appears to be separable as such, what defines the novel, Lukács famously writes, is that it carries, quote, the fragmentary nature of the world structure into the world of forms. And while we may well be unlikely today to accept the more or less mythical and metaphysical terms with which such fragmentation is posited in the theory of the novel, it has continued to raise the question of the degree to which literary form can be understood as something like a mediation of the social, the means by which forms of sociality appear somehow within artistic form itself. From this perspective, then, the consequent question would be, what are thus the social dimensions or implications of the apparently formless? What is often felt as the formlessness of the novel, as what puts it, writing of Defoe and Richardson, as itself an issue of literary or artistic form, and thus as an expression of historical experience. One means to addressing this question would turn, I think, on the shifting understandings of abstraction and concreteness that traverse Lukács's own discussions of form, from Soul and Form and a Theory of the Novel onwards. Lukács's historical proposition here is clear. The Greeks, as he puts it on the nature and form of the essay, quote, felt each of the forms available to them as a reality, as a living thing, and not as an abstraction. However, quote, today we have either abstract form or else there is no form at all. Form thus founders against life, or at least against modern life, to evoke the title of Lukács's 1909 essay on Kierkegaard, and for the young Lukács, necessarily so. So the basis of this argument, which I think obviously very few people would accept with good reason today, but that's crucial to the Lukács's early work, is that essentially form never appears as such for the ancient Greeks and for forms like the epic, because form is not separable from life. It's specific to modernity that form becomes separated from life, and therefore form becomes both something intelligible and a problem. Yet equally, it is hard not to be struck, as is Judith Butler, for example, in her introduction to the recent English edition of Soul and Form, by the question of how to relate all this to the later Marxist Lukács's, particularly emphatic insistence upon precisely the need for a certain kind of form to apprehend, in Butler's words, the interrelations of social forces amidst the string of apparently unrelated events and details making up capitalist life. Famously, it is this that underpins the pivotal Marxian account of realism developed by Lukács in the 1930s, particularly in his essay Narrate or Describe, which opposes a writer like Zola's, quote, obsession with monographic detail, in which, despite or because of the extraordinary sensuous suggestive power of such detail, the materiality of the world is rendered, as Lukács puts it, transferable and arbitrary. I'll come back to that term transferable in a moment. So this is opposed then to what he calls the capacity of Balzac's or Tolstoy's novels to make us, quote, experience events which are inherently significant, and in which the detail must be so selected and so depicted from the outset that its relationship with the totality may be organic and dynamic. Narration, as form in a strong sense, establishes proportions, Lukács writes, description merely levels. Consequently, in what he calls the abstract view of Zola and Flaubert, or of Joyce, Dos Passos and Proust after them, life, quote, appears as a constant, even-tenoured stream, or as a monotonous plain sprawling without contours. I want to come back to various aspects of this argument in a moment, and the rather different way in which the abstraction of this abstract view is understood by comparison to the earlier discussions of form as abstracted from life. But clearly then a certain account of abstraction is indeed central to both Lukács's early and late analyses of the very nature of form and in relation to the novel in particular. Importantly, this is, again, an emphatically historical proposition, for if every novel must risk what, in an explicitly Hegelian register, Lukács calls bad abstraction, this is not a contingent possibility, but rather a necessary logic generated by some abstraction inherent to the given reality of modernity itself, with which the novel is confronted. To better understand the historical account which underlies this, it is worth returning for a moment to the principal source of Lukács's early account of the novel and of form itself, in what comprises little more than a page or two of Hegel's Aesthetics. So this is a fairly lengthy quote here from Hegel's Aesthetics, which is a 1,000+ page book in which Hegel talks about the novel across roughly 2 pages, but it's those 2 pages which very much frame Lukács's later accounts of the novel, not only in his early work, but I think through to the later Marxist work as well. So here's the quote. But it is quite different with the novel, writes Hegel, the modern bourgeois epic. Here we have completely before us again the wealth and many-sidedness of interests, situations, characters, relations of life, the wide background of a whole world, as well as the epic portrayal of events. What is missing is the primitive poetic general situation out of which the epic proper proceeds. A novel in the modern sense of the word presupposes a world already prosaically ordered. It is then on this ground and within its own sphere that it regains for poetry the rights it had lost, so far as this is possible in view of that presupposition. Consequently, Hegel continues, one of the commonest and for the novel most appropriate collisions is the conflict between the poetry of the heart and the opposing prose of circumstances. So far as presentation goes, the novel proper, like the epic, requires the entirety of an outlook on the world and life, the manifold materials and contents of which come into appearance within the individual event that is the center of the whole. But in the more detailed treatment and execution here, that is in the novel, the less the novelist or the poet can avoid bringing into his descriptions the prose of real life, though without for that reason remaining himself on the ground of the prosaic and the commonplace. End quote. It would not be hard to show, I think, that under rather different historical circumstances, it is this dialectic that determines at every point Lukács's early accounts of not only the novel, but of form more generally. If the Greeks, as Lukács writes in 1910, felt each of the forms available to them as a reality, as a living thing, and not as an abstraction, whereas today we have either abstract form or else there is no form at all, then it is because, as he puts it in the theory of the novel, we have invented the productivity of the spirit. That is why the primeval images have irrevocably lost their objective self-evidence for us. Sorry, that's the quote on the next page. I'll start that again. We have invented the productivity of spirit. That is why the primeval images have irrevocably lost their objective self-evidence for us, and our thinking follows the endless path of an approximation that is never accomplished. Endless path of an approximation that's never accomplished. As we'll see, this idea of endlessness is central to Lukács's account of formlessness. We have invented the creation of forms. And that is why, Lukács continues, everything that falls from our weary and despairing hands must always be incomplete. Excuse me. While for the Greeks, form is then, strictly speaking, not form at all, since it cannot be separated from matter or reality, according to Lukács. The modern creation of forms, that is precisely the requirement to make forms in the first place, means that all form by definition teeters on the edge of what he here calls incompleteness, an endless path of an approximation that is never accomplished. Perhaps the clearest account of this in the early work comes in the dialogue concerning Lawrence Sterne, titled Richness, Chaos and Form, that Lukács composed in 1909. Written as a dialogue between two students, Joachim and Vincent, each of whom seeks to impress the, quote, strikingly handsome girl who acts as their audience. The two sides of the exchange represent the alternate arguments for the primacy of form or life in relation to the judgment of Sterne's novels. While significantly the winner of the argument remains unresolved in the text, although it is the exponent of life rather than of form who gets the girl, it is the critique of Sterne's writing from the perspective of form that is probably of most interest here. The dialogue begins with Joachim's comparison of Lawrence Sterne with Goethe, in which the former's work appears from the perspective of the latter, a, quote, confusion of heterogeneous bits and pieces in a raw, disordered state. Sterne's prose can be taken only as raw, unprocessed matter, which, quote, makes no effort to unify them, to give them form, however imperfect. As such, Joachim argues, it fails to distinguish between value and non-value anywhere. Sterne, he continues, didn't compose his work because he lacked the most elementary prerequisite for composition, the ability to choose and evaluate. Sterne's writings are a muddy flood of unselected matter. For Vincent, by contrast, it is exactly Sterne's richness, fullness, life, which marks him out as a writer to be placed alongside Shakespeare and Cervantes. Against this, Joachim's objections are possible, he argues, quote, only in abstraction, merely formal, he states, running after Sterne's sovereign extravagances with an accountant's yardstick. Yet if Sterne's Tristram Shandy speaks here for a certain concreteness and richness against the abstractions of form, from another perspective, the formlessness of the novel's prosaic presentation of, quote, unselected matter has itself a form, albeit an apparently impossible one, at least in classical terms. As Joachim puts it, such works are, quote, formless because he could have carried on to infinity. Such works are formless because he could have carried on to infinity. And his death meant only the end of his works, but not their completion. Sterne's works are formless because they are extensible to infinity, but infinite forms do not exist, end of quote. I'll read that last bit again. Sterne's works are formless because they are extensible to infinity, but infinite forms do not exist. One straightforward reading of the relation of this early conception of the formless to Lukács's work of the 1930s onwards is that it is thus precisely such a threat that emphatic conception of realism, with its accompanying vocabulary of hierarchy and selection, is intended to address. Yet one does not have to follow the dubious conclusions Lukács draws from this, let alone the critical judgments upon naturalism or modernism that they famously entail, to note, therefore, the very real dilemmas concerning the question of form that they thus inscribe. For if, say, prose or the prosaic, in Hegel's terms, is the very condition of the novel's modernity as art, it cannot but also register the novel's essential relationship to the character of the opposing prose of circumstances that lies outside of art, as Hegel calls it, and which is constitutive of social modernity's world or life, and not only as a bourgeois world, as Hegel describes it, but finally as a world governed by the abstract forms of capital itself. The Hegelian prose of the world becomes here specifically, as Lukács puts it in Narrate or Describe, the domination of capitalist prose over the inner poetry of human experience. It is this then that resolves what might otherwise seem at first sight a problem for the later Lukács's association of modernism with naturalism, given that as opposed to the former's association with the abstraction of formalism in Lukács's work of the 1950s, the latter, that is naturalism by contrast to realism proper, would appear necessarily to be associated with a commitment to the concrete and the particular that is elsewhere seen as definitive of the novel. So, while in one sense, Lukács notoriously associates modernism with bad forms of abstraction as he sees it, particularly forms of formalism, naturalism, which he in turn associates with modernism, would seem to stress a kind of concreteness rather than an abstraction. However, Lukács performs, again by way of Hegel, a crucial inversion at this point, whereby the seemingly all too concrete prose of description, as exemplified by Zola and carried over into Joyce and others, is said by Lukács to mask what is actually a more fundamental abstraction inherent to the prosaic circumstances of capitalism. By reducing, quote, detail to the level of mere particularity, both modernism and naturalism, Lukács argues, replace concrete typicality with abstract particularity, in which, quote, this is the second quote on the slide, in which every person, every object, every relationship can stand for something else. Every person, every object, every relationship can stand for something else, according to a prosaic logic that would endlessly disrupt any conviction, as he puts it, that, quote, phenomena are not ultimately transferable. That key term again, this idea of the transferable. Because it is the ultimate in uniqueness, he concludes, as Hegel recognized, the here and now is absolutely abstract. The craze for the fleeting moment and for a factitious concreteness of 20th century European literature results in abstraction. The question is then, in what sense is this movement of abstract particularity the basis of a specifically capitalist prose? Lukács, would have to be said, is far from explicit about this. Nonetheless, one clue as to why the social character of apparent formlessness, from Stern to Zola and beyond, should be such a source of anxiety here would be, as we have seen, the relation it establishes between prose as extensible to infinity, or that is Hegel's bad infinite, the infinite that just goes on and on and on, and what Lukács terms, citing interestingly from Walter Benjamin's book on tragic drama, transferability, in which every person, every object, every relationship can stand for something else. For in the essential exchangeability of what it joins together, prose's lack of any natural or intrinsic limit on what the novel might depict or incorporate mirrors here, from the perspective of Marx's own reworking of the Hegelian bad infinite or bad abstraction, a parallel lack with regard to what can be exchanged in the universalization of, above all, the abstractions of money and of the value form itself. To put it another way, the potential formlessness of the novel, and hence what Lukács will term that form problem generated by this lack of any intrinsic limit on what the work might incorporate, also marks its troubling relation to that indifference with regard to what can be concretely exchanged via the force of money's abstract regime of generalized equivalence, or that is the domination of capitalist prose. The anxiety, in other words, is not so much one concerning a dynamic of dissolution or unworking of form per se, as it is a specific anxiety concerning the possibility that form as the social element in modern literature and art might finally be that constituted by capital's own objective production of a new prose of the world through the formation of an increasingly universal exchangeability under the domination of the value form. So this problem that Lukács sees of transferability between phenomena that realism or epic form resist, I'm reading here as a kind of equivalent to the problem of transferability in money or in capital accumulation. That is the sense in which the nature of money is to render things purely exchangeable and therefore transferable from one to the other. With appropriate caution, we might well refer what is at stake in this back to what is probably the earliest philosophical account of the form of money, that is Aristotle's discussion of money and exchange in Book 1 of the Politics, and in particular of the threats the latter poses, according to Aristotle, to the order of the polis, the city-state, and to the proper role within the city-state form of oikonomia, it's the kind of domestic economy, as subordinated to political life. Like the formlessness of prose's extension to infinity, exemplified by Stern's Tristram Shandy, famously this concerns for Aristotle above all the potential for what Joseph Vogel terms a ruinous escalation, associated with the monetary function in general and with this spatial expansion of trade in particular, whereby the natural, quote unquote, limits of commonality constituted by the form of the polis are destructively and unnaturally breached. The aberrant use of money, as Vogel puts it, thus raises the spectre of the ruin of the polis and of its communal form. In his fascinating book, Money in the Early Greek Mind, the classicist Richard Seaford suggests that the unsettling effects of monetization for the Greeks, both abstract and concrete, visible and invisible, are located here in particular in the collision between what he calls the unlimit of money and the limit inherent in ritual. Displacing ritual forms of exchange, the money form then produces an abstract and impersonal exchange and circulation of things as a competing and inexhaustible mode of social being. It is this that is then taken up in Aristotle's Politics, where the unlimited or boundless wealth accumulated through monetary exchange poses a specific threat to the necessary limits of the form of the polis, through which the wealth that is properly adequate to the good life of the political community is measured in its natural end in domestic use. The result is, as Seaford notes, a series of polarities that inform Aristotle's Politics: self-sufficiency versus trade, goods versus money, limit versus unlimit, natural bounds versus unnatural accumulation. What Lukács terms modernity's productivity of spirit, associated with the onward and potentially infinite propulsion of prose, or with the necessary invention of forms, is here then equatable to the unnatural potency of money itself, and thus of its tendency to expand into the infinite and unbounded. In Aristotle's own words, as against the natural order of limits and cyclical return, money-making means monstrously the breeding of money. Or as Vogel puts it, in the boundless proliferation of money and its offspring, a spectral double or travesty of the natural order is invoked. An erratic movement is unleashed that perverts the internal dynamic, driving the growth and preservation of the political organism or the political form. The form of formlessness in Lukács is, from this perspective, then, precisely this boundless proliferation, the spectral double of universal exchangeability, and hence of an abstraction of the concrete itself for the domination of social life by the form of pure exchangeability. Ironically, in this sense, formlessness turns out, therefore, to be governed by what, in his reading of Marx, Chris Arthur calls, by virtue of his indifference to and elision of all material content or matter of the objects that he exchanges, what is precisely a world of pure form, which has no natural limit, since as pure exchangeability, there is nothing in principle that it can't relate. So exchangeability could just go on forever and exchange everything in principle. There's no limit to it. Although Lukács does not explicitly say so, capitalist prose is in this light the reflection above all of an abstractly formal society in which social being is generated first and foremost by the indifference of exchange itself. As a question of social or political form, the consequence of this, as Marx writes, is that in capitalist societies, money directly and simultaneously becomes the real community, and at the same time the social product of all. But as we have seen, Marx continues, in money, the community is at the same time a mere abstraction. The community of antiquity, include, of course, the community of Lukács's epic, presupposes a quite different relation to and on the part of the individual. The development of money smashes this community. By contrast to the social forms and bonds of earlier limited and more personal communities, the real community of money is, on Marx's account, formally unlimited, and thus threatens progressively to dissolve all other forms of mediation or of value, or at least to reconfigure them in its own image. This throws a rather different light on, for example, Ian Watt's observation that among the most obvious results of the application of primarily economic criteria to the production of literature in the early novel was to favour prose against verse, whereby, quote, bringing it under the control of the law of the marketplace, assisted the development of one of the characteristic technical innovations of the form, its copious particularity of description and explanation, end quote. As Joachim recounts in Lukács's dialogue on Stone, the latter once said, quote, as a joke, that he would continue his novel to infinity if he could only get a good contract from his publisher. Yet this prosaic logic of potentially infinite addition, as Moretti terms it in the modern epic, where there exists no organic fetters to hold it in check, and which is, as he writes of Joyce's Ulysses, capable of connecting everything with everything else, is not only that of mechanical form, as Moretti himself suggests, but is itself reflective formally of a certain internalization of the logic of the marketplace, what we might term the prosaic equivalences of the real abstraction of the value form and of money itself. To the extent that naturalism, as Lukács declares, threatens to deprive life of its poetry, reduces all to prose, this is thus far from unique to Zola and his contemporaries, but reflects a tension between the abstract and concrete, form and formlessness, that is necessarily immanent to the novel of a capitalist world per se. Paradoxically, what the history of the novel's theorizations have thus confronted in the problem of form and formlessness is arguably the novel's mediation of a certain irreducible actuality of abstraction, constitutive of the everydayness of a modern capitalist social life as a whole, insofar as, the forms of money and value are themselves constitutive of that everyday life. As Adorno argues in his short essay on Balzac, in the struggle to conjure up in perceptible form a society that has, with the irresistible ascendancy of the exchange principle, already become abstract, and in which individual life crystallizes only in the midst of total interchangeability, or again exchangeability, realism's very ardor for concreteness runs up against the problem of an abstraction immanent to reality itself. While this problem is one that may certainly be intensified by early 20th century modernism, it reflects the degree to which a crisis of concreteness is thus already internal to realism and indeed to the 18th century novel. Extended beyond the novel, this gives a particular importance to what, for example, in aesthetic theory, Adorno terms modern art's wider struggle to resist its collapse into, quote, a literal facticity, or the merely empirical, in which we are no doubt meant to recognize the dilemmas of a certain avant-garde dynamic of the ready-made, the found object, of montage, and so on. As Adorno puts it, the principle of individuation in modern art is not a given but a directive. This directive not only encourages particularization and thus the radical elaboration of individual works, it at the same time obscures the boundary against unformed raw imperia, and thus threatens the structuration of works no less than it sets it in motion. Prototypical of this, Adorno suggests, is the rise of the novel in the bourgeois age, the rise of the nominalistic, which he means individualistic, and thus paradoxical form par excellence. It's worth saying that Adorno has much in common with Lukács at this point, not least in the ways in which form simply is for him the distinguishing aspect of art in general. As he puts it in aesthetic theory, form repudiates the view that artworks are immediately given. If form is that in artworks by which they become artworks, it is equivalent to their mediatedness, their objective reflectiveness into themselves. Moreover, it is precisely this that determines the formless as that unformed raw imperia, which thus threatens the structuration of works no less than it sets it in motion, and from which art must thus, according to Adorno, successfully separate itself. However, in Adorno, crucially, this is a dynamic process, itself related to changing social forms, since a continual testing of the boundary against unformed raw imperia not only threatens the structuration of works, but also sets the modern artwork itself in motion, and is thus one basis for his claim in aesthetic theory that, quote, the unresolved antagonisms of reality or social reality return to artworks precisely as immanent problems of form. From this perspective, formlessness, as in this instance the apparent form of the novel's capacity for endless proliferation and accumulation, both mimics the bad and infinity of money and the accumulation of capital, but is also necessary to its modernity as a literary form. In its immanent engagement with the spectre of formlessness, that is to say, art reflects the contradictory character of sociality in capitalist societies more generally, as societies dominated by the abstractions of exchangeability and accumulation, and which are themselves constituted through a continual dissolution and reconfiguring of social form. Or to put it another way, formlessness is itself a part of what Schwartz terms the objectivity and historicity of social forms. I shall finish there. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you, Roy.
David?
Hey. Hi, Sandra.
Hi. First of all, I would like to apologize for my, in fact, my very absurd lateness, but I had a problem here with the computer.
No problem.
It wouldn't access Chrome. It wouldn't do anything. So I'm sorry about that. So I had to ask George Manzi and George Almeida to take care of you and introduce you to everybody. But, you know, I'm just sort of stepping in here to perhaps invite both Georges to make their comments on your talk. And this is more or less what we had agreed to do. So I don't know who wants to intervene first, Manzi or Almeida? You decide.
Jorge, please.
Jorge, okay. Jorge and George. Let's do it like that. Jorge, okay. You start.
First of all, thank you very much, David, for this fascinating argument. I have some commentaries and maybe some questions that come after it. I think there are two main commentaries. The first one is, I found it, for me, it was very illuminating this way that you think about two modes of abstraction in modern art and literature. One would be the obvious one of abstract art, that like an art that doesn't have as its content, explicit content, the materials of life. like abstract art, I don't know, Mondrian and all that tradition, Kandinsky. But you, based on Lukács, talk of naturalism, that's absolute concreteness, as abstract. And you open the door there to think about the novel as abstract art, abstract literature, since Balzac, and building there on Adorno's argument as well, as the life, modern life and society is already abstract. If you take that life as your material, historic material, you're going to have an abstract form in some way. And that is what I understand you begin to formulate as formlessness. Formlessness as an equivalent or an imitation of a social form. In this case, what you think of social form would be the forms and the abstract forms of capital, accumulation, exchange value, this leveling, this concreteness that feels a bit like meaningless, as Adorno puts it on the position of the narrator in the contemporary novel. So this is, I guess, this is a motif of imitation, of reification, imitation of abstraction. So I would like there, if you could comment on how do we, if the formlessness is a formal expression of that, how can we as critics or maybe writers imitating that social form can criticize it or affirm it? Like, I think there's a risk there in turning to an affirmation, merely affirmative of capitalist world or capitalist prose. And there's, I think we have a lot of cases of writers that imitate that logic and criticize it. I think Flaubert there is a major example, like interpreted by Rancière. It turns into some kind of affirmation of this leveling, but interpreted by people like Lukács or Moretti, we can see another dimension, a lot more critical of this leveling out. That's one level. So if you would like to comment on that risk of turning into affirmative, mere facticity, capitalist facticity, maybe speaking about some examples. That's one. I don't know if I do it. I just follow the comments and do just one big comment. But maybe that's better and dividing it. Okay. The second one, David, is about the contemporary art debate. I think that you have engaged in some interventions yourself, I think, is intervening in that debate in a very original way. I would like to hear you about how you have done that, like this, with, I don't know, your conversation with philosopher Peter Osborne, like in this art in general debate that is about formlessness as well. How have you been able to bring the theory of the novel to dialogue with the philosophy of contemporary art in a like productive way? I would like you to comment a little bit about that. And in that line, I have been wondering if your work is not some kind of expansion on the concept of nominalism of Adorno's aesthetic theory, that if I'm not if I'm right, I think in a lot of passages of the aesthetic theory, Adorno takes the novel as the first step in that nominalist process that goes beyond the novel. That I think, and this is something polemic, I think we talked a little bit of this in February in England, that the question, is there a qualitative break in this nominalist process after which the novel would not be the principle or the model of the form, the formal expression of this nominalist process, and there goes installation, site-specific art, this prose that is art and is document as well, and I don't know, these kind of formulas of Sebald that says my medium is prose, not the novel, like wanting to say that in this nominalist process, maybe the novel opened the way in this novelization, Bakhtinian novelization of all the arts. But it looks like, and I'm trying to argument in that direction, that the novel no longer seems to be as convincing a form to express this nominalism, and with that, the social form of capitalist contemporary prose. So those are the two main big.
Yeah. Thanks, Jorge. Let me take the second one first, if that's okay. So the relationship to contemporary art debates, which you're right, is very interesting, and it is something that I guess you mentioned Peter Osborne's work, and something that I've been in some kind of dialogue with Peter about, I guess, for a while. I suppose there's 2 points for me. I mean, one is to what you find in someone like Peter's work, and you find a lot of other theorists of contemporary art, someone like Thierry Dudouve, is a tendency to see these processes effectively kind of beginning in the 1950s and 60s with the reception of Duchamp in contemporary art in that period. Whereas I think, and you're right, that I think Adorno thinks, although he never really develops it, that one can trace this back to the kind of beginnings of the novel, and that the obvious parallel is in that precisely that sense of its kind of infinite expandability, including its infinite capacity to kind of incorporate all possible materials. In the case of the novel, though, obviously that's limited by and large to text. I mean, you can think of Sebald with his photographs, or you can think of Stern with his diagrams and his blank pages and so on. But essentially, the novel obviously is about that kind of infinite incorporation of different kind of discourses, isn't it? Of different textual discourses. Whereas what obviously you get with what used to be, as it were, the visual arts after the 1960s is an incorporation of a much wider and therefore speculatively more infinite kind of series of materials, since it can use text, but it can also use architectural forms. It can use older traditional media, new media, etc., etc. So partly I've just wanted to make a certain connection to point out that there is a kind of longer history to this process, because I think sometimes even in the very best work on kind of contemporary art, there's a tendency to think of all this just, say, beginning in the kind of 1960s, or at the earliest with the historical avant-gardes at the kind of beginning of the 20th century. And I think there's a much longer history to it than that. I think the other reason why, I know you're quite keen to abandon the novel, which I understand in some ways, at least in the sense of, that quote from Sebald about, my medium is prose, not the novel. I think the history of the novel itself, though, has always been about precisely that kind of limit, that kind of overstepping that limit and then reabsorbing that limit, of which Sebald is just another, example. I think that's what's precisely already there in Stern, in Richardson, and all the kind of classic 18th century novelists. It's what's there in 19th century realism. It's what's there in Joyce, and etc. So in a way, without wanting to be too conservative, by reabsorbing everything back into a kind of existing form, there is a certain sense in which there's a kind of inescapability of the novel in that idea of, yes, it's just prose, not the novel. I think the other dimension to that in relation to contemporary art would be the one of the benefits, I think, still of thinking about that kind of Bakhtinian idea of the novelization of other art forms, interpreting it in different ways, obviously, than Bakhtin himself does, but this as a kind of alternate narrative to the narrative of something like post-conceptualism, to the kind of narrative of, what it is. Of course, it has itself a very different social field, going back to Bakhtin, but also in other kind of use of it, which is to do with things like popular cultural forms, which give that. So something like that process of novelization is obviously what you see running through then in film and television and video games and so on and so forth in some ways. Whereas the post-conceptualist trajectory, of course, tends to be an art institutional trajectory. And it's often more radical than the trajectory of novelization, but at the at the cost, as it were, of its connection to popular cultural forms that the kind of novel has historically also embodied. Does that kind of make sense? I haven't really formulated the last part of the answer, I fear, fully, but yeah, I mean, I think I think it is crucial to think of the way in which the novel articulates for us a much longer history of that kind of dissolution and reconstitution of form that then post-60s art is a kind of another chapter within, in that sense. The first question, yeah, this is a really difficult question about I suppose I mean, if you mentioned Rentier reading of Flaubert, which is an interesting one, because of course Rentier himself wants to see this as democracy, you know, albeit with certain kind of caveats. And my argument against that has been, well, the kind of forms of equality and leveling that he describes are also, of course, the forms of the value form. They're also the forms of exchangeability and a different kind of leveling. But I suppose I would ultimately still want to take a kind of a Dornian position, which is a kind of what I guess I was gesturing towards in a bit too telegraphed fashion at the end of the talk just now, which was the kind of the dynamic of this is the need for art and literary works to continue to immanently register these kind of social forms as the price of their relevance, as it were, you know, and that there obviously the hope within that is that there are ways of critically immanently registering them rather than simply reproducing them in their form. You know, so this is, I think, wrongly in this instance, but this was Adorno's argument against something like surrealist montage, was, you know, that it essentially just mimics the form of capitalism but leaves it as it is. It doesn't kind of transform it in any way. I think he's wrong about surrealism in that respect, but one could take the point. I mean, one could view what I'm arguing as saying, so that, yeah, the novel in some ways is constituted through this continual immanent engagement with this problem of formlessness, and that problem of formlessness is the problem of the forms of accumulation and monetary exchange, and therefore it's simply kind of affirmatively reproducing those forms. I don't think that has to be the case, and I think, you know, the history of the novel would attest to that. But I do think there's always going to be that ambivalence, because in some ways that incorporating social forms of capital is the condition of something's modernity, and the condition therefore of its kind of relevance in some ways. That I think that's the complicated point about Adorno's argument around autonomy, which is often misunderstood. That you know, although Adorno stresses that sense precisely around form of needing to separate from empirical reality in some ways in order to constitute art, it is itself is also a social fact, and in those terms, it's also immanently registering the social contradictions of reality, and it has to do so, otherwise it just becomes decoration or, you know, a pleasant form of entertainment or whatever. So it's always caught in that kind of double bind, I suppose, in that ambivalent position, which is also then partly the job of the critic, of course, to draw out the kind of critical elements of that, I guess. Does that?
Yeah. Oh, that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma.
Yeah, exactly, and it is a dilemma. I think it's an irresolvable dilemma. I think that's the point. I mean, I don't think there's a way in which any individual artwork can ever resolve that.
And I think it's interesting how much it has to do with the critic. Finally, like, yeah. I don't know, Rancière and Auerbach and Moretti, Lukács reading the same work. But
yeah.
One sees affirmative democracy, if we want to put it like that. The others see all kinds of negativity. And the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what we were talking very briefly about before we started with Georges about, you know, the reversibility of Lukács's judgments, because it's the same thing, isn't it? You know, Lukács is wielding all this to condemn Zola and naturalism and to condemn Joyce and Dos Passos and so on, as simply giving in to kind of this domain of capitalist prose where, you know, Tolstoy and Balzac are trying to overcome it in some way. But of course, you can read it in the reverse direction and think that, you know, it's also it's a way of critically registering those processes, you know, not of simply giving into them in that way.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Excellent. Fantastic questions. Thank you, Roy.
Well, thank you, David, for such an interesting lecture on some themes and issues that are also of utmost importance in our discussions here at the Lero.
Oh, great.
It was really interesting. I noticed that you tried to build a bridge between the young and the Marxist Lukács. Life in the first one, and later monetary and class society are both in a tense and dialectical relation with the possibility of form. In both cases, however, we hear, reading Lukács, the influence of Schiller and his concept of Formtrieb. I can translate it maybe in English as formal drive.
Yeah.
Derived from the moral and aesthetic need to provide meaning in a capitalist fragmentary society where meaning is at risk. How do you see the relationship between form, meaning, Bildung, and the formlessness of the novel as a genre? That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second one, if I may so,
Sure.
Theodor Adorno, in his later musical essays, discussed what he referred to as the ideal of musique informelle, a term with a challenging translation. I don't know how it was translated in English.
It's left untranslated because, as you say, you can't translate it.
Maybe formless music. Later, he addressed the problem in his aesthetic theory. Even if modernist works could not rely on a pre-existing form, model, conventions, modernist artists and novelists still strove to create an original and coherent form in their works.
Yeah.
However, Adorno drew a distinction between modernism, which still aims to arrive at a form, and vanguard, or avant-garde, where the procedure is more important than the final result. In light of your captivating lecture on the formlessness of novels, do you think that Adorno's insight remains critically productive in the theory of the novel? If so, in what ways? Thank you.
Again, fantastic questions. Thank you so much. So the first question relating to Schiller and finding meaning. Yeah. So yeah, first of all, yeah, I'm absolutely trying to kind of create some relations between the young and late Lukács, because I think what you see is the way in which the kind of the problems set out in things like Soul and Form get reworked in the 30s and the 50s into the kind of the accounts of modernism and realism and these distinctions between Zola and Balzac and so on. But obviously certain terms drop off. And one of those is kind of life in that more kind of vitalist sense that he's getting from, Bergson and Nietzsche and so on, one presumes, as well as Romanticism, so that obviously drops off for, obvious political reasons as much as anything. But there is still that problematic, as you say, of for Lukács, the importance of realism is its drive to give meaning to the world, and that obviously is strongly linked to form in particular ways for Lukács, but particularly things like selection and hierarchy. So that in Lukács, what the problem with Zola is that there's no selection, there's no hierarchy. Everything is described, everything's kind of thrown in. I don't think any of this is fair to Zola, actually, but this is the reading of Zola you get in Lukács. Whereas in Balzac, there are these hierarchies of significance, and there's a sense in which this event is meaningful, and therefore this is the one to be represented. But we don't, you don't need to represent this, and so on. And that, I think, very much goes back in some ways to the kind of soul and form essays, just to things like the dialogue on Laurent Sterne. In that way, it's a very similar kind of problematic. So there's definitely a continuity in that, even if obviously it becomes interpreted more in terms of a kind of Hegelian Marxism than a romantic Hegelianism, as it were, in something like theory of the novel. Whether it's I think what's tricky to grasp in the later Lukács is to what degree it's kind of giving. It's also giving a kind of meaning to meaninglessness. That I think that's because I think clearly in the early Lukács, the kind of transcendental argument, in the kind of historico-transcendental argument in the early Lukács is that the Greeks inhabited a meaningful world. They inhabited a world in which meaning was immanent to that world, and therefore uncontroversial. So the famous beginning of the theory novel where he says, happy are the ages that have no philosophers. You don't need to debate meaning because meaning is just there. It's just given and it's immediate and so on. And it's obviously, it's the loss of that for the early Lukács is what produces this problem of the kind of abstraction of form. Form can only be abstract because there isn't any kind of given meaning in which form would be simply at home in the world, in which case it wouldn't even be recognizable as kind of form because it wouldn't be separable from that kind of world. In the later Lukács, I think that's a bit unclearer, in part because I suspect Lukács himself is a bit less clear about the actual meaningfulness of the world, as it were. Is it that Balzac and Tolstoy understand the meaningfulness of the world and are able to give it form, or are they making the world meaningful? Just you see what I mean? And I genuinely not sure that that's clear in the later Lukács. Whereas clearly the criticism of things like Zola and Joyce is that they just give over to a kind of meaninglessness, and therefore in Joyce particularly it just becomes formal play and so on. The other thing I would say about that is that it's clearly implicit in this distinction between poetry and prose in Lukács that continues right through into the later works in really kind of interesting ways. So he's still talking about the novel in the 50s as a form of poetry. So he still talks about it as poetry as opposed to the prose of the world or capitalist prose and so on. So there's an interesting sense there that poetry is the meaningful, but prose is just the stuff that's out there, equivalent to kind of matter and life in his kind of earlier works. Whereas poetry kind of gives meaning in some way to the world, and so he still wants to think that the novel is a kind of a form of poetry in that sense, not a form of verse, obviously, but in the kind of wider romantic sense, I think, of poetry. Sorry, went a bit off topic there. Second question about Adorno, and that's amazing essay music in Formel. I mean, obviously, one of the things that Adorno is responding to there, and that's a really crucial issue of cross aesthetic theory as well, is that kind of, I suppose, we have a kind of hyper formalization that you get in things like surrealism, so which he seems always to have had a slightly ambivalent attitude about. So on the one hand, he kind of sees the way that surrealism comes out of kind of early atonalism as a kind of necessary development of the form, but he also doesn't much like it in some sense because it's a kind of because it over formalizes the expense of this other side, which is mimesis, in Adorno's peculiar use of that term. The sense in which it it mimics the kind of stuff of the world or the stuff of life in that sense, so that what music in Formel is meant to be a kind of reaction to, in some sense, is that kind of hyper-formalization. On the other hand, there's another interesting argument, of course, in Adorno, that you could also see that hyper-formalization itself as a kind of mimesis of contemporary capitalist societies, of the state and administrative life and abstraction, all those kind of other things. So that, when Schoenberg and Webern and so on go towards these much more formal, highly or hyper-formalized kind of modes of music, that they're also in some way miming or mimicking those particular social forms again. And then again, that will go back to Jorge's question about, is that the problem for Adorno, I guess, is it critically mimicking it, or is it simply reproducing it in some ways? I think, Beckett, I guess, would be always the most interesting example in Adorno, because there's a very clear sense in that he sees in Beckett a similar kind of mimicry of that formalization. So the kind of turning human beings into kind of machines and the kind of very abstract formal structure of the play and so on. But he thinks that that's embodied there in forms of kind of suffering, which make it a critical interrogation in some ways of that kind of mimesis. I think he's less clear about whether he thinks that that's what Schoenberg and Webern are doing in that sense. But I think that, that is kind of interesting. I mean, I guess the question that isn't quite addressed in Adorno, but it's an interesting one, is whether that hyper-formalization is itself related to a certain kind of problem of formlessness. So I would think of it, I don't aware of Adorno ever mentioning it, but an interesting example of something like Oulipo in literature, the sense in which in Oulipo you have to invent, in Lukács's terms, new forms, new constraints, new kind of algorithms, as it were, right? Because of the total collapse of any given forms, so that you have to create new forms with the awareness of their kind of arbitrariness, with the fact that they don't have a kind of a social basis as such. But again, in Adornian terms, of course, that itself, you could argue, becomes a kind of social mimesis of a kind. That kind of abstraction and rationalization and hyper-formalization that you get in these kind of works is itself a kind of mimicry of certain central social forms in developed capitalist societies in that way.
Or the complete self-consciousness of form in some postmodernist novels.
Yeah, absolutely. So where form becomes a part of the content in kind of complicated ways, absolutely. I mean, the other side of it, there's a kind of longer version of this paper that I'm working on that has a bit more on this. I dropped it out for today, but I was trying to think of kind of the contemporary equivalents of some of these older debates. And as it's think a lot about autofiction. I don't know if the kind of French term generally used to refer to.
Yeah, we are very used to this.
You had that, okay. You never know how these things have travelled into different languages, as it were. But obviously, there are also quite an interesting question around a lot of that kind of writing. Not only obviously because it's so clear, it's kind of blurring that line between formed art and simply life, reality in those kind of early Lukács terms, but also I think again about that kind of those problems of exchangeability and transferability that go back to your problem of meaning. That the sort of one of the really interesting things about, if you've read Knausgaard, the Norwegian writer who's written this 6-volume thing called My Struggle, Mein Kampf in the original. And the fascinating thing about that, I mean, fascinating. It's a really boring book to read in many ways, but kind of fascinating as a book, I find, is the way in which everything is rendered equivalent. That what's fascinating about it is that, and this is part of the nature of the length and the strange kind of way in which it imminently registers this kind of formlessness, is the sense in which everything is exactly the same significance, and therefore there's no kind of sense that this is more meaningful than than that. So he'll spend just as long writing about going to the off license as a 15-year-old as about the death of his father. They're just, everything is kind of, there's 35 pages on doing the washing up, and that seems a kind of interesting contemporary end point, or at least a certain kind of limit point of that sense of imminently absorbing a certain kind of formlessness into, or making that the form of the work in some way. But obviously Lukács would have, this is Lukács's nightmare, because this is the complete eradication.
I would say that he inherited all the bad features from Zola.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. It's like that to the power of 10.
Yeah. Composing still lives without the dynamic movement that makes art revolutionary and political significant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sandra, I think we have some questions from the YouTube channel. Vinicius. Your sound is... Você está sem som, Sandra. Você continua sem som, Sandra.
I'm muting. Okay.
There you go.
Finally, yes. I don't know what's happening. I think, I have two computers and neither of them is actually working well today. I don't know. I think the problem is me, not the computers. We have asked whether anybody would have any questions, but no questions have actually been either typed here or so. No questions.
It's okay.
But maybe I don't know if David would like to talk a little bit more about Joyce.
But Joyce,
I'm asking because I'm very uncomfortable about the way Lukács refers to Joyce, and not that he has written much about Joyce. As a matter of fact, it's comments in passing, I would say, more than a full essay, as in the case of Stern, for example. But maybe if you could comment a little bit more on that, or what your take on his take on Joyce, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I mean, like you, I don't think he's a good reader of Joyce. I mean, even if we kind of reverse the polarities of his value judgments, which is not true of, say, someone like Kafka. I think he's an interesting reader of Kafka, even though he doesn't like Kafka. Actually, his work on the essay on Thomas Mann and Kafka is very interesting, I think, on Kafka. I don't think the same is true of Joyce. Partly, I suspect, because he was a bit of a prude in a strange way, and I think he had the same reaction to it that a lot of other figures of that time, and to Zola as well. That he
Virginia Woolf.
Virginia Woolf, exactly. He didn't like that it had a lot of sex and going to the toilet and so on in it, because that was decadence, right? I mean, he had a very straightforward sense of modernist decadence, and Joyce fell with Zola in that. I think where he is interesting, I mean, not so much as a good reading Joyce, but where he is interesting is, well, I think there are two things. I mean, one is the strong connection he makes between Zola and Joyce, and I think that's kind of right. I mean, and I think that is an important dimension to thinking about Joyce, particularly in the first part of Ulysses. That there is a certain sense in which he's kind of hyperbolizing certain tendencies in Zola. That kind of focus on the detail and the sensuous material, and then just run wild with it. So you could say kind of similar with Dos Passos as well. So I think that connection that Lukács makes is a kind of interesting one. I suppose the other one is that, because I think this is, although he doesn't anywhere as far as Moreri develop it in relation to Joyce, but where it fascinates me, I suppose, again, is that Ulysses seems to me one of the reasons why Ulysses is the kind of exemplary early 20th century novel, I think, is again because it is that interesting mixture of abstraction and concreteness, isn't it? The sense in Lukac's terms, so the sense in which it is this proliferation of concrete detail on concrete stuff, the prosaic side of it in the most basic sense, and it is absolutely that proliferation and accumulation, and the sense of it being able to go on infinitely. But at any other time, of course, it's a novel that's deeply engaged with kind of abstract forms in all sorts of ways, starting, of course, with the Homeric model, which is in some ways a kind of absolutely perfect illustration, although Lukács would never have seen it, of in a way, a lot of the historical shifts that he is describing, something like Theory of the Novel. So he talks about Don Quixote, and he talks about the ways in which in Quixote, in Cervantes, the form becomes kind of abstract because it becomes separated from that kind of embeddingness in any kind of reality. And that's the kind of point of the novel in some ways, obviously. I don't think he could see the ways in which something like Ulysses is also doing that in kind of interesting ways at that much later historical moment. The ways in which it is playing with that problem of kind of the abstract form of the epic, or the sense in which the form of the epic has become abstract, and then how that is then concretized in these kind of complicated, often parodic ways in the kind of novel. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying, I think you could do a kind of Lukácian reading of Ulysses, but I don't think Lukács himself ever provided that that reading in any kind of adequate way. I think Joyce was not one he had, as I say, it's not like kind of Kafka. He had enough, maybe Proust as well. I think he had enough kind of respect for what they were doing, even though he didn't like it, to engage with them properly. I think he really didn't like Joyce. He really didn't like Musil, for example, as well. So what you get from that, and Beckett as well. So you just get the worst bits of Lukács in those bits where he bangs on about their sickness and decadence and so on and so forth. And he just thinks of Joyce as a straightforward formalist, which is so obviously wrong. I mean, it's
Well, thank you. Well, just a comment that came from one of our students. Lucas Marcondes says he doesn't have a question, but he wants to thank you for your insight on Stern's work and the concept of formlessness.
Thank you, Lucas. Very kind.
Jorge?
Jorge?
Do we have still time for a question, or are we?
I think it's up to David. I mean,
he's sure.
To tell us enough is enough. So
I need to go eat some dinner soon, but I can take another question.
I have this last one.
Yeah, go for it.
It's a bit in name of Fabio Sousa Andrade. To ask a bit about Beckett. It is an interesting case about formlessness and about the thing prose and novel, this prose and novel distinction.
Yeah.
I think that you have said that you don't know if the late prose is a novel at all. Yeah. So maybe I would like to reflect a bit about that. First, I want to read a quote that you must know of Beckett that I love. And he said the following. He says, this is an interview in the 60s, I think, that he says, quote, "The confusion is not my invention. It is all around us, and our only chance now is to let it in. The only chance of renovation is to open our eyes and see the mess. It is not a mess you can make sense of. To find the form that accommodates the mess, that is the task of the artist now." I think this is pretty interesting about this formlessness, the form of formlessness, nominalism. He's writing in the 60s in dialogue with minimalists, conceptualists, another kind of neo or post avant-garde. And the problem he's formulating, we could think of it very close to the novel, but he's not writing novels anymore after the trilogy, the post-war trilogy, right? And I wanted to ask you about, or maybe comment and see if you have seen something like that, or what do you have a comment on it? I have seen some kind of scenic or dramatic drive, a strong drive to approach that is more scenic, more dramatic, and less narrative, that maybe starts like systematically with Beckett. If we think of his late prose, the question of the scene, of the voice, the scene where this mess is accommodated. I don't know if it's formed, but it's scened. I don't know if that's the right word in English, but this scene drive that gives a mold, a form, maybe a frame to the formlessness. And I thought this Lukácsian in the theory of the novel, that there's two ways, right? To abstract every material of the world until you can give it form. And he says that's the idyll, the idilio. I don't know how that's said in English, the idilio.
The idyll?
The idyll, I don't know, like bucolic thing we imagine.
Yeah.
And the other one is the one that is more Balzacian, and I would guess still this guy, my struggle is on that. That's to bring everything in and show that fracture, show that formlessness, like everything in Joyce. Well, Beckett's secretary of Joyce, very close to that formlessness sense. He goes on and he abstracts to the scene.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm seeing this very much in Latin American, Brazilian, Chilean, and Argentinian contemporary prose. Nuno Ramos, Verónica Stiger, Diamel Altit, Sergio Chekvek, and so on. They are looking to dramatize and to activate scenes where this formlessness can be examined, can be like questioned in a more lucid way, or than maybe this baggy monster of the Jamesian. I don't know. There's something in this?
Yeah,
and it's not idyllic, right? Beckett is not. He reduces, but this is not no kind of bucolic.
No, not at all.
Think about that in terms of this. Maybe this distinction between abstraction from life, that was this first type of abstraction, and this formlessness or naturalism, this maximalist way of bringing concreteness that is already abstract. Maybe this is kind of a meeting between these two lines. I don't know. It's a comment. I don't know if it's
it's a great question, and thanks first of all for reminding me of that quote, because I'd completely forgotten it. And actually, it's a very apposite and useful one. And as you know, I used to write on Beckett many years ago, but I haven't really worked on him for quite a long time. So a lot of this stuff is now disappearing from my my memory, unfortunately. But I mean, Beckett's always so hard to position in these things, isn't he? Because he, even more than Joyce, he always seems to be doing both things at once in some kind of complicated way. I mean, I think you're right that of all those writers, but Beckett would be the hardest one in those kind of late prose works to reincorporate within the novel, or who tests it to its limit in the most effective way. Because Sebald's really is easy, you know. I mean, Sebald's, you know, he can say what he likes, but he's absolutely in a certain tradition of the novel, you know, and I think kind of in some ways quite uncomplicatedly so. But Beckett really is, possibly because of the extent of that abstraction. But again, it's a very odd abstraction because it's a very kind of, you know, it's often that very fleshy material abstraction, not least perhaps when it's being kind of scenic, you know. I think it's sort of like Commensaire, you know, which is this nightmarish kind of Sardian, but very formalized, abstract kind of relationships, you know. I suppose the question there would be, would we again go back to the kind of where I began anyway? So, you know, if you're trying to follow through on that kind of Lukácsian, Adornian sense of form as social, what would be the social form of the mess in Beckett? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the social form of the mess in Beckett would be. I think it's easier to see the social form of the abstraction, because in a way, there is very obviously stuff there about kind of instrumental rationality and so on. You know, that you think of later things like catastrophe or something, you know, and reading those back into the way that Beckett abstracts these kind of, you know, forms of administration and etc. The mess is harder, I think, because obviously it is a bit harder to do to think, well, what is the social form of formlessness? So the one I was trying to trace in my talk, I guess, was one that's very particularly connected to that sense of kind of infiniteness and incompleteness and the kind of unbounded and so on. But I think Beckett's mess is probably a different kind of formlessness than that. But yeah, I'm not sure immediately what I think it is. I mean, there would be other forms again, like bataille, the am form in bataille, which is a kind of version of an idea of formlessness, but again would be very different to the one that I'm describing in relation to
it. Is a bounded mess. It is a bounded formlessness. It's still formlessness, right?
Right. Yeah. So, but that idea that the only form that would be I can't remember the exact quote, but the only form that would be kind of worthwhile would be one that would accommodate the mess. I think that is what I was trying to say, and what I think is a kind of Adornian.
But the thing is, he says accommodate, not to form the mess. He says accommodate.
Accommodate the mess, yeah.
I think that's. Yeah.
But of course, in accommodating it has to give it form in some way. That's always going to be the paradox of the.
Not only give form, but give a strict, rigid, constructed form.
And Beckett, yeah, of course,
taught to the detail. So maybe the mimesis of the mass, the social mass, must have as a consequence this rigid constructiveness of the form of the work of art or the drama. So, and then there's another concept that's very important in this discussion: formlessness, money, social construction. That is alienation, because alienation and meaning, the novel historically has to deal with the problem of the alienation, have to deal with it since the beginning, since the 18th century. Yeah. And in the 20th century, alienation is so widespread that it alienates the possibility of give meaning to life in the extensive totality of life in the Lucasian terms through a well-organized novel. So then the fragmentariness of Döblin, Beckett, so Joyce, Kafka, and everyone.
Yeah, no, I agree absolutely, and I think you're right in a way. Alienation has been the obvious way in a sense of understanding that kind of continuity in the novel since the 18th century and thinking about those different forms of alienation. I suppose partly what I was trying to gesture towards at the very end was about alienation as part of a kind of broader forms of kind of dissolution, or broader forms of kind of social dissolution, which then one would want to think about the specific social forms that dissolution takes, as it were.
That's interesting. In a Lucasian essay like Kafka or Thomas Mann, we see that Kafka represents alienation and Thomas Mann discusses alienation.
Right. Yes.
And that's a very important difference. And Lukács is striving to find the new meaning of the realism. So he takes the side of Thomas Mann, but he makes a wonderful analysis of Kafkian procedures. Yeah. He only judges it as not adequate to be followed. But I think alienation is the problem in late Lukács views of the novel and realism.
Yeah, I think so, and I think because rightly he wants to historicize alienation, obviously, but then he tends to have a very kind of fixed view of how that's done. So the only way you can see to do it, as you say, in a way, is almost to discuss it. So it's almost to kind of present it as historical in a very direct, kind of discursive way. The idea that art might have other ways of getting across the kind of historicity of alienation doesn't seem to strike him. Even though, as you say, he's quite an interesting reader of Kafka, and actually seems to kind of appreciate Kafka in a way that he doesn't, say, Joyce. I mean, he clearly admires Kafka, even though he thinks it's kind of...
But the problem is that in a socialist society, alienation should be surpassed.
Yeah.
And he advocates that we had already a good socialist society.
Right.
That was the problem.
Yeah, I think
political problem that went to a critical problem.
Yeah, and that of course is what colours all his kind of commentary on his earlier work as well, like the later preface to Theory of the Novel, which I think is 1960 or something, you know, where he's self-criticizing himself on precisely that kind of basis, you know, and seeking again to kind of almost reverse his judgments within that, you know, because Tolstoy doesn't come out that well from Theory of the Novel, for example, but it's, you know, becomes the major figure in the later stuff with Balzac. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh well, thank you so much. That was a real pleasure.
I think we should let David go have his dinner.
I will go and eat some food. As you can see, it's dark here now, but
yes, we know it's 3 hours different, so it's dinner time, right?
dinner and a glass of wine, I think.
Thank you very much, David.
I shall toast you all in episode.
It's been a pleasure, really.
Let's do it again sometime. Really good.
Yes. Let's try to keep in touch and do it again. But thank you very much for agreeing to give this lecture, and thanks again for, you know, being so so easy to cope with the requirements of this online transmission and all that. So thanks again. Hope to meet you soon.
My pleasure. And
thanks, George and Jorge, for the interventions and comments and questions and all that. And thanks for the public as well, who's been faithful, loyal to us until now.
Vinicius for the direction of the screen.
Sorry?
Vinicius for the screen direction.
Ah, yes, Vinicius for the technical, thing that we don't know anything about. So he's been responsible for making this possible. But thanks again, everybody, and hope to see you soon.
Brilliant. Very nice to meet you. See you again.
Yeah.
See you soon. See you.